Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to Knime for the Data Analyst. In this chapter, we're going to talk about ways to make your work readable to other people, organizing your workflow in such a way that it's easy, logical to understand, and easy to maintain. You're going to go back to workflows many times that you created long ago, and you want to be able to remember your work, and documentation is the key to doing that. I know that we've talked about it once before, but it's worthwhile to come back and revisit that one of the first ways that's very useful for you to document your workflow is to simply define it right off the bat. When I click on my workflow, inside the description node over here on the right is information useful and searchable for other people. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the Edit tab and say something more than this. I'll put a description in here to say this workflow demonstrates techniques I used for my class on 12/1/89. Just something. And if I'm going to have some tags, tags are going to be referenced inside of the Knime Hub, and we're going to be talking about the Knime Hub next. So we'll talk a little bit more about that for later. And any information around URLs or things that are important to reference about this workflow that I've done, when it was created and who created it, so that it's able to come back and say, this is who I want. There. It's again useful as you come around and you look at example workflows. It's always nice to be able to look at it and say, this task takes the adult data set to predict income from demographics. You wouldn't know that by reading just building a simple classifier. You don't want people to have to open every workflow you have to find the one that you're looking for. Workflow annotations allow you to highlight a group of nodes that are functioning together to perform a collective task. It's purely decorative. It's simply meant to make your workflow more readable and understandable to somebody who didn't author it by collectively documenting what it's doing. Let's take a look at an example. This is a Knime sample workflow, and you notice at the top they put a brief description. This is really before they allowed definitions of workflows, but they put a brief description. And then they grouped the first three nodes together and they called it the data import. And then they have the pre-processing section, and then they have the transformation section. So they're using these annotations. They're just rectangles that you're drawing around blocks of nodes to help kind of group them together. It's just visual. It doesn't impact the processing at all. It's just visual to make people understand what this workflow is actually doing. Additionally, I can actually have workflow annotations within annotations. So let's say I wanted to take these first part of the pre-processing, I wanted to take these first four fields and put them together. So I can right click wherever I want, because I can move this wherever I need to. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to say new annotation. And Knime creates one right off the bat for me. And yellow is going to be its default color. So just since I'm putting yellow within yellow, I'm actually going to change this to be, how about red? That's fine. And the width is a little high, so I'm going to bring this down to something more like 5 or even maybe 3. Get a little more, and I can type some text in here. Word pre-processing is first. Okay. So it's just, I can click on this and I can reshape it. And so somebody can see, and I can move it. And say I want this to be, now you see how it's snapping to the grid, and I've mentioned before I don't like that. That's why I'm not a fan of 20-point grids. So So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change that grid size to 10 to give me a little more flexibility in my control of how I'm going to move that. See, now I can keep it off the line here. Gives me a little more granularity. So now I've got an annotation within an annotation. And again, you have control over the fonts and other things like that. And you've seen me do this a few times, of course, but I put a sentence or two, a statement, something below most of my nodes so that the casual observer can follow your workflow without having to open the nodes. For example, if you put a row filter node in, that's of no help to somebody who's never seen your workflow. They don't know what rows you're kicking out. So I'll put a slight description under it to say, you know, remove rows with missing values, or, you know, that type of description is very helpful for somebody trying to understand your workflow. In this sample Knime workflow, you can see certainly that they've actually put a few comments into some of their nodes, like you know, convert to documents, binary vector creation. They're trying to make some notes. I would prefer to see a lot more documentation in work. So if you were one of my employees, I would expect you to be doing a lot more documentation about what it is you're actually doing in this node. Another very important tool for making your workflows readable are metanodes. Metanodes are created to help you organize your work by combining workflows, not by just surrounding them with an annotation, but actually collapsing them down into a single representative node. That way the user only sees the basic processes without having to see each individual step, while still retaining the idea to drill deeper into that set. So let's walk through a quick demonstration of how it is you'll create and use metanodes like this. So let's take a look at the sample workflow I have here. And I can take this first step, the document import, and say, look, these are 3 nodes, and I'm just going to take and highlight all 3 of those nodes by just holding the mouse button and highlighting them together. And I'm going to right click over the group right now, and I'm going to say create metanode. And it's going to want me to give it a name, and I'm going to use the same name that it has right now, which is data import. And when I click OK, those nodes have now been dropped down into one single node. Now you can still see my main document up here. If I double click on the data import, you'll see it's opened up that original tab, and I still have all the details behind it, and I can still, if I hit the execute button, it'll still execute that and passes it out to the end. So think of it like a subroutine, what I've just done here. And now I can make this just, again, a little easier to follow the flow. I'm going to walk further down here, and I'm going to take this section right here. I'm going to take the pre-processing, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to collapse that down into a metanode. And I'm going to call it pre-processing. And you see how this now becomes, all of a sudden my whole workflow becomes a lot easier to read, and I can still double click into the pre-processing, and I can see the individual steps being done. And in fact, you'll notice now pre-processing has a metanode itself within it, has term filtering. If I double click on the term filtering, you can see that they're doing even more with this. So you can have as many layers as you want, metanodes within metanodes within metanodes. Anytime you start to feel like things are getting cluttered, I tend to break things up and put them together. So I'm going to finish this. I'm going to take transformation, and I'm going to create a metanode, transformation. So, and then finally model and score. So I'll create a metanode, so my workflow is just significantly easier. I can still put in information just like I did before, so I can type a node description here and say read data from my S3 bucket. And you can still put all the descriptions you want. You can still put additional annotations and say I still want to annotate these last two nodes separately to say they're doing something else. This is just all about, like I said, making your workflow readable and usable. Now, one of the other things you might need to from time to time is if you have to go in here, I can right click over the metanode and I can edit the setup of it. So basically by reconfiguring it, I can change its name. I can change its ports. For example, let's come in and look at the model and score and say the scorer node that actually gets executed out of here has a data port. It puts out a confusion matrix. So I could turn around and say I want another node to be able to read that. So I'll go into the metanode and I'll reconfigure and say I want to add a data port to the output of this node, which is now there. And now when I double click, I can connect my confusion matrix to the output, and now the confusion matrix will flow through this workflow. You can have as many ports coming in or out as you like, and all the different ports that Knime supports are available. So again, you might have data ports, database connector ports, data ports, flow variables, lots of different things that will come in and out of that. Components are nearly identical to metanodes with one extremely important difference. Components are fully encapsulated. This means that any changes you make to flow variables inside your component will not be reflected and visible outside. So your component can work on things without fear of breaking something outside the component. This is what makes them reusable, so you can reuse a component over and over again in a workflow. It's Knime's preference right now. They go back to their recommendation would be to use components more often than not when you have a choice. Let me say for a moment that I've decided I don't want to have a metanode. I want to have a component here. One of the interesting things I can do here is I can right click over this metanode and I can actually expand it, which will basically bring it back to the way it was. So basically I brought all the nodes that were in it back. So I've decided I don't want a metanode anymore, so I've returned it. But now I'm going to turn around and highlight those same nodes, and this time instead of creating a metanode, I'm going to create a component. And I'm still going to call this one model and score. And you'll notice it looks slightly different when I'm working with a component. And again, this is Knime's preference going into it. Now, when I double click on a component, instead of taking me there, it actually takes me to the configuration of the component. I actually have to go into the component and say open it. The other thing you can do is hold the control key and double click, and you'll also open the component. That's how I get there. And you'll still see it's passing variables or ports or data, everything through here. So again, I can come back and into the component and change its setup and say I want to add a data port to it. And if I hold the control key and double click, I can now add that confusion matrix and say I want that to come out of the component. Every variable that you want to flow into this component, you'll actually have to double click on the component input and choose all of the flow variables that might exist that you want available. You'll double click here. Same with what goes out. If there are variables that you have changed and you want the outer world to see what those changes are, you'll have to add them to it. Otherwise, those variable changes will be encapsulated inside this module only. So I showed you a kind of a manual process of expanding and re-expanding. Knime allows you to simply do the conversion yourself. Under this metanode, I can say convert to component, and it will do it that quickly. So that makes it easier as you start to go down this path. One other thing I like to do with components is I like to color them. You'll notice that all of Knime has specific colors for different nodes. So I'm going to open the model and score, and you'll notice now here I can provide a description for this component. I'm going to edit this and say, you could type text here, what it is, and you can document just like Knime does, what are the input ports, etc., and select a node type. Is this a learner node, where they're typically green? Is it a manipulator, the ones that are yellow? The data source nodes, for example, with your database readers and file readers are orange. So I like to try to match the colors that normally would do here. Since I'm in modeling and scoring, this is a predictor node to me. And finally, I can drag and drop PNG files onto this. So I have a couple on my desktop that I was recently using. I might take this this unlock image here, for example, and drag that onto the picture here. And let me try that one since it didn't. There we go. And now when I save my changes, now I've got an actual icon. So when the person calls model and score, the component, they understand roughly what it is this component is doing, and I might even have a little icon here to help demonstrate whatever it was being done. That's really the difference between, so components are fully encapsulated, metanodes are really just used to make code readable by building little buckets of subnodes together so that it's easier to follow your workflow. This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.